Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. We continue our Election 2018 coverage today with the race for District 5 Commissioner on New Mexico's Public Regulation Commission. It's an extremely important position that sets rules on public utilities and transportation businesses like taxis and ambulance services. The Republican in the race, Ben Hall, said that he canceled his appearance due to a family emergency. I'm pleased to welcome the Democratic candidate for the half hour today, former State Senator Steve Fischmann. Steve, thanks so much for being with us.
It's terrific to be here.
Great to have you here. I mentioned that you used to serve in the state legislature, decided not to run for re-election, but you have decided once again to get into this business of elected office, which is a tough business. It's difficult. New Mexico in particular has faced, in the last decade that I've been here, a lot of controversies in the legislature, in the governor's office, and in the Public Regulation Commission, the post that you're running for.
Right.
Why did you get back into this again?
Well, I have two passions in public policy. One of them is poverty, and the other one's the environment. And the Public Regulation Commission happens to have a huge impact on both. So we've got about 40,000 people probably across the state who have their power shut off every year because they can't afford to pay their electric bills.
40,000?
Somewhere in that neighborhood.
Wow. So,
and it costs them hundreds of dollars to get reconnected. And of course, these are the people who can least afford it. I see lots of inefficiencies in the way that the PRC operates. And I have kind of a deep background in management, business management, and there's just a ton of things that we can address that I think create opportunities to lower cost for consumers. And then on the environmental side, New Mexico has these tremendous resources, solar in particular, but wind as well, and we just haven't taken advantage of them. So if I look at El Paso Electric, our local utility, they're operating at about 3 to 4% total renewables generation out of all the power they generate. And that's just criminal in New Mexico, particularly since nowadays it's much cheaper to do renewable power generation than it is to do fossil fuels.
And of course, there are good reasons for this, correct? I mean, you have written on our website, krwg.org, and with other outlets as well, about this very issue, that the way that incentives are set up for electric utilities is they have a built-in incentive to build power plants because they can get a profit from that extra capacity that they put online, correct?
Well, so I'll restate that. You're very close, is that they get compensated under current rules. They get a profit equivalent to a percentage of their total asset base.
So the actual value of that new power plant that they built.
So if I have $1 billion of assets as a utility, I'm entitled to $100 million of profit a year. If I have $2 billion of assets, then I'm entitled to $200 million of profit a year. So a utility, if they want to maximize profit for shareholders, they want to build as many assets as they can, whether we actually need them or not.
Okay, so you've argued very passionately in commentaries about this issue, saying that this is not what consumers need, and this is not also what we need in terms of the environment, that we ought to be focusing on renewable energy, particularly in a state like New Mexico, where we have the highest of potential for solar and for wind.
Yeah, and where it's very cheap compared to other places to do solar and wind. And the PRC, in its rulemaking capacity, has absolute authority over how utilities get compensated. So I'm not necessarily after utilities' profits. If they're excessive, sure, I want them to do well and be healthy so they can serve the public well. But we need to create an alignment between consumer needs and utility needs.
Okay, so now the devil is in the details. If you are elected to the PRC, how will you look at setting up incentives so that electric utilities will do more to invest in solar and wind and other renewable sources of energy, rather than building, as you have argued that there's the building of, for instance, natural gas electric generation that you say we don't even need, that it's an extra amount of capacity that is more than what we actually need.
Well, if we manage the grid properly, it's more than we need.
Yeah.
So it's more than just building. When you have this perverse incentive, you tend to manage the grid a different way. So if you want to build more assets, you manage the grid so that the maximum peak use is as high as possible. And that creates the need for these plants for a few hours a year, but most of the time they don't serve us at all.
Yeah.
So it affects everything about the way you manage the grid. And it's a fairly complex deal, but it's really not beyond the grasp of the PRC to understand and for utilities to manage. I cannot say exactly what the rule I'd put in place would be in terms of compensation for the utilities because that would violate the quasi-judicial part of the responsibility. It would be like a judge announcing a verdict before he heard the evidence.
But you are saying, though, that we need more incentives for renewables.
But what I would say is that we don't, renewables are so cheap, they shouldn't need incentives. What we need to do is sweep away the disincentives that have been put in place at the PRC through rulemakings.
Okay.
So as far as rulemaking, we can do two things. One is, as I say, align utility interests with customer interests so that their profit increases when they save consumers money, not when they cost consumers money. Their profit increases when generation is cleaner, not when it's dirtier. So without presupposing the exact solution, because we'll bring in all kinds of stakeholders to decide that, that's where we need to move from.
Okay, let's say you get elected and you have enough support on the PRC that this occurs, that we do have electric utilities now more interested in solar energy, more interested in wind energy. Do you see any impediments to this? Because, of course, we've been hearing a lot for years about the difficulty in building large transmission lines, for instance.
Yes.
The route for those have been up in the news, even involved with White Sands Missile Range, concerns about interfering.
Talking about SunZia.
Yeah. So, well, that's one example, though.
Yeah.
I mean, there could be others. As you know, with wind energy, there's concern about possible wildlife impact. Some people don't like the aesthetics of large windmills, but these are issues. These are real issues.
Well, those are all legit.
Yeah.
And I lived in California when Altamont Pass wind farm went up, and they had all kinds of problems. And if you go to homes nearby, you hear the windmills and you hear the vibrations. Wind is not free of environmental impacts.
Yeah.
So you really do want to be careful about how you place it and where, and you want to get community buy-in.
Yeah. At the same time, we have a lot of open land in New Mexico, and other people would argue, there's a way to do this. We can manage this.
And quite frankly, the state land office has lots of parcels that are just ideal for this kind of deal, and that would generate revenue for education.
Yeah.
If we placed wind there. Our biggest impediments right now are really within the PRC itself, where there's kind of an old culture that distrusts renewable energy. they still think of it as new, but the industry around the United States, solar and wind are well established and very reliable sources of electricity. Battery storage, well, that's more in the developmental stage, but Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, they've recently had bids for solar plus storage, battery storage, so that you can get energy when the sun isn't shining, for 3 cents kilowatt hour. Well, the cheapest to build a new fossil fuel gas plant is about 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour. It's not even close. So when utilities decline to do it because they say it's experimental, I'm sorry, 3 of our neighboring states, I'm not talking across the world or anything exotic, 3 of our neighboring states are going in on it. Xcel Energy Colorado plans to be 56% renewables and save $500 million in the process by 2026.
Yeah.
Where did I say El Paso Electric is? 3%.
Yeah.
That's costing us.
And we also should point out, by the way, that another possible benefit of this kind of policy is, and you worked in business for many years with Levi Strauss, you know this, one of the companies that tries to be socially conscious.
Sure.
We have real examples of this in New Mexico with Facebook moving here in particular because they wanted their data centers to be served by solar energy. So there is a possibility, there is a potential to attract more companies like this.
It was difficult to even move PNM on renewable energy in any meaningful way until Facebook came and it put PNM in the position of saying, oh, okay, we're going to lose Facebook for New Mexico because you guys wouldn't do it?
Yeah.
We wouldn't be in solar unless Facebook, as an outside corporation, had pushed. And I think it's telling that it takes an outside corporation rather than good, solid public policy focused on constituents to get there.
All right, so talking about public policy focused on the people, focused on society rather than just focused on particular special interests.
Yeah.
There's another issue that I want to ask you about, and it's something that you may not get asked about very often, but I think it's very important, and I want to get your opinion on the change in net neutrality rules. This is something that comes under the purview of the PRC. There are states, as you know, around the country that are saying, even though the federal government said that we no longer need net neutrality through the FCC, there are states that are saying, wait a minute, no way. New York, California is saying, if you want to do business in our state, net neutrality is the law. What do you think about this?
I think the states, I applaud every state that is throwing up roadblocks to the end of net neutrality. We need net neutrality. To me, I don't care how complicated the arguments is, what the gobbledygook is. Eliminating net neutrality only has one purpose, and that's to enable access to be limited so you can drive up the price. It's just creating scarcity so that special interests can drive up the price. We need to treat the internet as a utility, if you will, in the sense that everybody has access, everybody can use it, everybody's access is equal.
And I should say for our viewers, if folks are not familiar with net neutrality, this is the idea that internet traffic is treated equally, so that if you want to go to krwg.org, you will not have a slower connection to a small nonprofit website that can't afford to pay an internet service provider for a fast lane basically. So that's the idea, and
Exactly.
this gets confusing because a lot of times we do stories on things like net neutrality. We don't explain it, and I get questions after the show.
Well,
what were you
good.
talking about?
Just think of it like a public roadway. What would it be like if some of us could get on it whenever we wanted,
Yeah.
and then other people were charged a toll every time they needed to get on it?
Exactly.
And when you get rid of net neutrality, that's the kind of situation you create.
The example I used, of course, was also full disclosure that we have an interest in this here at the station. So I'm not asking the question for that reason. I'm asking because you're running for the PRC. But we do have an interest in this. And really, experts argue that everyone has an interest in this because the internet becomes more and more important in our lives each and every year for all sorts of things that we do.
Absolutely.
And if we have this kind of gated system, it could cause all kinds of havoc.
Well, and internet access is already a huge problem in New
Yeah.
Mexico,
Yeah.
particularly in rural areas, and eliminating net neutrality just makes it worse.
Are there ways the PRC can make broadband more accessible in rural areas?
Yes. But first I should mention new legislation that was passed, I guess, a year or two ago, basically puts all internet regulation in the state of New Mexico, gives it all to the feds, except for one thing, and that's the Universal Fund. And the Universal Fund is there to support communities that have inadequate broadband access. It can help subsidize the installation of affordable internet service in those areas. There's a big problem right now because it's been funded by a surcharge on landlines. Well, we don't exactly see the amount of landlines going up, so that the amount of funds has gone way, way down. And there has not been a good planning process to take care of the biggest need areas in an orderly way.
Okay.
So we need to, one, address that, and number two, we need to get the revenue generation mechanism fixed, and the PRC can have a big say in that, such that we get enough resources that we can actually do a job that New Mexicans deserve.
Okay.
So.
Net neutrality, a very big issue, generates a lot of interest and directly affects consumers potentially. Another one that directly affects consumers, you've written about this, you've talked about this, is I want to get your position on electric utilities treating folks differently if they make an investment, a personal investment, to have solar generation at their home, to put, for instance, solar panels on their roof.
So this is a nationwide controversy.
Yeah.
Utilities typically claim that it costs them a lot of money to service those people with special meters, and that other customers are subsidizing those customers who have solar energy. There are other groups, consumer groups and environmental groups, that say, well, no, actually we're saving you a lot of money because now we take a lot of stress off your distribution and transmission system, particularly at the peak hours, and that actually we're saving everyone else money. So again, this is one that I can't prejudge because I might be sitting judging on some cases involving how we decide this issue. But we need to get the full evidence in front of the commission before we make a decision. I think wisely, there was just a decision on the commission to not allow an SPS, they're the electric utility for the East State. They wanted to charge a fixed surcharge on solar owners. And frankly, it didn't present any clear evidence that it actually cost more. They just kind of made a lot of casual assumptions. Of course it costs more because we have meters and we have this and we have that. And the hearing examiner, in my view, correctly determined, well, no, you can't just look at one side of the equation. We need to look at a very thorough study of what the impact on the grid is. And you have not done that. So we can't grant you that at this time. So I imagine if I get elected, I will have an opportunity to look at that issue in more depth.
Okay, and I'm glad you mentioned hearing examiners, because for those who are not real familiar with the PRC, the way you have described, I can't give you a definitive answer because I may have to make a decision on a case before me. This job that you are applying for, asking the voters to hire you, is not simply like a courtroom where you go in and you are the judge based on evidence presented to you. There are professional staff members who make a recommendation and tell the commissioners, this is our recommendation, here's why. You get a professional report. But there is some concern about this, and you have this actually on your campaign website. You have a link to a report that was done in 2017 by an outside group that said there are concerns about whether or not our PRC staff in New Mexico is adequately funded. And they specifically mentioned salaries, not a unique problem to the PRC,
Sure.
that we have some state positions that have salaries that are much lower than market rate, and you may not be able to attract always folks to do those jobs that you want. So talk about this issue.
So first of all, the study was done by the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, which is kind of the nationwide, the preeminent trade group, if you will, for regulators. And their basic finding was they didn't feel that the PRC is currently operating in a way that they're capable of doing the job correctly. That's a pretty damning finding. Certainly staffing and budget is part of it. But there's another piece of it, which is the rulemaking side of it, which is very soft on the requirements that it asks of utilities when they make filings to the commission. And they make filings that are often where the facts are not consistent, where there isn't a very specific format that defines what information is needed in these filings and how it should be developed. And as a result, the staff is left to run around like crazy trying to make sense of these filings. And it literally takes them away from doing the core work that they should be doing into turning into babysitters to get the right data.
And I got to be honest with you, Steve, I don't very often give, in interviews, I don't very often give opinions. But as you can imagine, one of the things that is universal is that we are all consumers of electricity, right?
And we don't have a choice. Yeah.
So like a lot of people watching at home, in my electric bill, I have gotten these pages and pages of filings to the PRC with a request from the electric company to do something. And it's a bunch of legalese that if I was not a lawyer, and even if I was a lawyer, I might not fully grasp what the heck it is they want to do and whether they can do it.
Some of your PRC commissioners can't understand
Yeah,
it.
so is this an issue? I mean, that we need to...
And this is all part of the same thing. So I would very much like to do rulemakings. And I've actually talked to staff about this at the PRC and a couple of other commissioners who I'll be serving with, saying, we need to codify in our regulations what these filings look like.
Right.
And we also need to codify that there needs to be an executive summary in plain English that not only commissioners can understand, but the public can understand.
Sure.
And that needs to be in a concise format that includes all the major changes being recommended in your filing. And,
I mean, that's part of, that's just part of, some would argue, good public policy, that it's transparency, because if folks get this thing in their electric bill and they have no idea what their electric company wants to do that may affect their rates, how does that serve anything?
Well, you're right. And transactionally, just look at it, is we have no choice but to use them. They've been awarded this incredible asset as the utility.
Yeah.
And what we get in return is to say, oh, you don't get a peek inside of how we're serving you? Mm-hmm. Yet you have no choice but to accept this? Well, you wouldn't even be here It's not like you earned this business, it was given to you. And we as consumers deserve to know everything about how you operate, and that's transparency at every level.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about that.
Well, yeah.
I hate when we get stonewalled by
Well,
these guys.
you've written about many of these issues extensively, and many of the people watching probably have read them in the newspaper or at krwg.org. With that in mind, we are quickly running out of time, and most of the things that I've asked you to answer have been under my control today. I've asked you specific questions. I'm going to give you the floor to name an additional priority you would pursue if you're elected to the PRC, and why it's a priority.
Well, there's so many because they regulate so many areas. But
let's get a biggie in.
I have a particular concern about rural transportation, and with electric cars and self-driving cars coming on board, and Uber and Lyft ride-sharing models, I think we can use a little bit of imagination to come up with some much better regulatory structures to encourage those kinds of services being made available to get rural folks who don't have a car to the hospital when they need it. Part of that has to do with ambulance service as well. Some of the time it's a neighbor taking someone to the hospital, and it's someone who's bleeding, and it's not just dangerous to the patient, it's dangerous to the person giving them the ride.
Right.
They could be exposed to something. So I think there's a lot of work we can do in that area to help rural transportation, and I think rural transportation is right up there with broadband as being critical to the economic health of all those rural areas in our state.
Okay, very important information. Much more that the PRC does, and your election to this we could talk about, but a half hour is all the time we have.
So I probably bored people to death already. Thanks for hanging in there, folks.
We ran out of time. Steve, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you at home as well. That is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio every weekday. It's morning edition from 5 to 9, fresh air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.